Hello, and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much once again for joining me on the program today. And as we always do, I want to make sure to give you a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means any gifts that you do choose to give to us to help us out, to educate the church and the world, are tax deductible. So we would ask that you would go to justandsinner.org and you can figure out how to donate there. There are a bunch of links and numerous ways that you can contribute. Well, on the program today, we are going to be continuing our series on Christology, and we've been discussing the issue of canonicism. We have been discussing the nature of Christ's humiliation. Just in the past program, we looked at some of the history of the discussion surrounding the humiliation of Christ. Before that, we first looked at some of the church fathers. We didn't really look at the medievals because Widener doesn't really say much about the medievals. And then we kind of jumped right into debates of the Reformation. So we looked first at the kind of Luther-Zwingli debates, how that relates to the doctrine of the humiliation of Christ. And then in the last program, we looked at some debates surrounding the humiliation of Christ that occurred within early Lutheranism. So we're looking at 16th century division between Chemnitz and Brenz, two very significant Lutheran theologians. Chemnitz probably being the most significant Lutheran theologian apart from Martin Luther, and then Brenz being another very, very important and well-respected thinker. So we looked at some of the differences between those two perspectives. I argued why I think Chemnitz's perspective is correct. I think Brenz leaves a lot of significant issues. And I do think that Chemnitz's view tends to be the view that Lutheran theologians take. I don't really know anyone in particular that I can think of that holds to Brenz's view. I think that Chemnitz's view ends up being kind of a moderating position when the canonic controversy shows up. So just a quick reminder for those of you who are watching this, maybe it's been a while, say, since you've listened to the last part or you just forgot, or you're listening to this just without any context at all for some reason, which you may be, and that's fine, but you may have a hard time following along because of that, but hey, that's your choice, I guess. So canonicism is essentially a movement that shows up in 19th century German theology. It is primarily Lutheran in its introduction, though it affects the Reformed Church pretty significantly as well. And the canonic theologians are well known for really one thing in particular, and that is their view that the humiliation of Christ is not just something that occurs according to the human nature, but the divine nature. So there is some kind of change in the divine nature of the Son at the moment of incarnation. And as we discuss, and we do have one of these talks on the canonic controversy, if you want the whole history of that and who the theologians and major ideas are. But there are a few different perspectives. One basically says that he kind of gave up his divinity altogether. Another perspective says that the Son retained his divinity, but gave up certain kind of attributes of divinity, which, as we've talked about, this also affects things like divine simplicity. Is there an identity between God's essence and his attributes? The canonicists kind of have to say no. They also have to say that there is a possibility of change in the divine nature, that the divine nature can change and still remain divine, which means that there are questions about divine immutability, meaning God's unchangeable nature, which is just a classical Christian conviction, which comes from Scripture, which says things like, I, the Lord, do not change. So you've got some pretty significant theological issues that you've got to wrestle with there from the canonicist perspective. But there you go. There's the basics of the canonic perspective. So on the program today, then, after that quick reminder overview, we are going to be looking then at the Lutheran dogmaticians and what they say about the humiliation. So what we're going to be doing here is kind of taking a look at some of the 17th century Lutheran dogmaticians with a view toward seeing how it is that they fit into the canonic controversy. So we're kind of saying, are they consistent with the canonic perspective, or do they come up with a very, very different perspective? Because it is the argument of the canonicists, well, at least some of them, the ones that care about being Lutheran. So people like Thomasius, for example, in his Christi Person und Werk, Thomasius sees himself as consistent with people like Johann Gerhard and the other 17th century Lutheran thinkers. He's going to say that and he's not going to say that they agreed with him totally, but he's going to say that he's really just a kind of taking their views in a further direction. He's taking the groundwork that was laid there and being more consistent even than they were with a lot of these ideas. So yeah, you see that in people like Thomasius. So Widener is really going to challenge that as we start to look at some of these figures. So we are looking at the 17th century dogmaticians here. Just some major names quickly to run through if you're not familiar with those figures, and we've already looked at some of them. I think most of this actually is in Hollatz that he's using here. David Hollatz is the last of the great. He's considered the last of the kind of great thinkers of that particular era of Lutheran theology. So he writes in the very beginning of the 1700s. It was the last publication of his. But Johann Gerhard is kind of one of the first figures in that era. You can look at Abraham Kolov as well as Johannes Quenstedt. So those are the major figures. There are plenty of others too, but those are the kind of four that really stand out above the rest. They're the most influential by far. So we're looking largely at the kind of post-confessional era. So after the publication of the Book of Concord in 1580 until, 1720-ish, something like that. That's kind of the general era we're speaking of. And after that point, Pietism has really started to gain a lot of steam, and the church really in Germany is largely kind of overtaken by the Pietist movement. And while there are plenty of still Orthodox, Lutheran Orthodox pastors and thinkers, there isn't this kind of great massive production of theology that you have in the prior century. So we are going to start looking here at the teaching of Lutheran dogmaticians. So we're going to start with some citations that Widener gives us from David Hollatz. This is on page 99 if you have the Christology volume. Our dogmaticians are in harmony with the decision of the Saxon theologians. And this was the Decisio Saxonica in 1624 that we discussed last time, if you want more detail about that. The incarnation itself strictly must not be called a self-renunciation. So we're saying that when we're talking about the humiliation, we're not talking about the incarnation itself just as such. And we've talked about this plenty. That it's not that the humiliation just consists in the fact that there is an assumption of a humanity into the divine person, but the manner in which that humanity lives itself out. So then they say, that he's citing David Hollatz here, he says this: for self-renunciation is predicated of the incarnate, or ensarkos. So we talked about that language that theologians sometimes use. Ensarkos is in the flesh, asarkos is apart from the flesh. So if we talk about the logos asarkos, we're talking about pre-incarnate Christ. Ensarkos, we're talking about the incarnate Christ. The Son of God, or Christ, the God-man, incarnation of the not yet incarnate or asarkos, Son of God. So when we're talking about the self-renunciation or the humiliation of Christ, he's just saying it's not true of the Logos, it's not true of the pre-incarnate Christ. We're speaking specifically about the nature of the humiliation. So there is no kind of eternal functional subordination of the Son to the Father like you find in some modern evangelical theologians like Wayne Grudem or Bruce Ware or others. And this has actually shown up in multiple writings of LCMS theologians. So this actually is not kind of unique there. John Kleinig has used some of that language of eternal functional subordination. And I love John Kleinig, so I don't mean to go after him. I think for the most part he's a wonderful writer. He's been very helpful pastorally to me and in just a lot of my development of my pastoral practice and spiritual life. I mean, his Grace Upon Grace is like a classic work of Lutheran spirituality. But I'm bringing this up to say that these errors do show up even in our circles too, and I think that they don't originate in Lutheran circles, but I think some of the rhetoric or some of the language is kind of inherited from some other sources in the evangelical world. I know that even my own writing and speaking, early on I used some phraseology that would lean in that direction, and have tried as much as possible to correct that. So, and I think that was because that's kind of what I was trained to believe as Orthodox Trinitarian theology in many ways, until I really started doing some work digging into these issues in the Fathers. But so the point is, we're talking about a humiliation. This is not some kind of eternal reality. We are talking about something that is true of the incarnate Christ in the state of humiliation in particular. The second point here that we have in David Halas, he says, when the self-renunciation is removed by exaltation, the state of incarnation remains. So the state of humiliation, so humiliation and incarnation cannot be, coterminous. They can't be referring to exactly the same thing, because we have an exaltation of Christ that is still an incarnate Christ, but is no longer in a state of humiliation. So that and the exaltation of Christ still being the incarnate Christ, I think pretty clearly kind of seals the deal on this question of whether or not the incarnation itself is a humiliation, or whether it's the specifics of how that incarnation was lived out in a humble life of submission to authority, and the submission to human weaknesses and infirmities that Jesus lived in his earthly life prior to the exaltation. Okay, so then he says this. I believe this part's Widener commenting on Halas here. He says, though we may speak in an ecclesiastical sense of the humiliation of the incarnation, yet it is only a great condescension, strictly speaking, on the part of the Son of God. So we could talk about, the humiliation in relation to the incarnation, but he says, strictly speaking. So here is where we want to have precision in our theological terminology. And it's true that, kind of in popular parlance, we may say one thing or another, but when you're dealing with kind of systematic theological texts like Widener is here, and you want to really get precise, the incarnation is, though we wouldn't call it a humiliation, it is a condescension. So condescension is the more proper term to use to refer to the incarnation. It is him condescending to us, but it is not by itself a humiliation. Okay, so then we go on. He's using Halas as his primary thinker here. He often does that with Halas, by the way. And the reason for that, I think the reason why Halas is so helpful is because he is at the end of this era. And so Halas is not, it's not that he's not an original thinker in any sense, but in many ways he's kind of a compiler. Halas is a great systematizer of all of the development that we've had from the time of the Reformation onward. So in many ways, I think reading Halas is getting the summary of what Lutheran theology is in that time period of the Reformation, and then that century and a half of kind of solidifying what it is that Lutheran theology actually teaches. So the title of this section says, the subject of humiliation is the human nature alone. So we're talking about the humiliation. We are not talking about a humiliation of the divine nature, but of the human nature that is in union with the divine nature. So Halas says this: Christ was humbled according to his human nature, considered in the personal union. The subject is the human nature alone. That's key here when we're talking about the kenoticist, because the whole point of the kenoticist is it's not the human nature that's partaking of the humiliation, it's the divine nature. And the kenoticists are going to argue that a view like you find in Halas here is actually a kind of phantom humiliation, because in order to be a real humiliation, they would say it has to be a humiliation of the divine nature in itself for some reason. Okay. And then Halas says, for the divine nature being immutable and most perfect cannot be exalted and humbled. So we have here the commitments to the classical theistic claims about immutability and simplicity is going to show up as well, that are really driving their rejection of what later becomes the kenotic ideas. So what you see is people like Halas, it's not like there's a major kenotic movement in the 17th century. But these thinkers are already seeing what errors could come up and already speaking to these things. So I guess the question is, were those answers adequate or not? Were they so inadequate that there was a need for the kenotic controversy? I don't think really. But in some ways, this really does depend on the question of divine immutability. Because if you hold to affirm immutability, you can't have a kenoticism. They're incompatible doctrines. But what you do find with the kenoticists, there becomes this rejection of a lot of classical theistic tenets. God becomes defined more as the greatest personality rather than kind of the object or the source of being. And because of that, there is not as much in the 19th century of an adherence to things like immutability or a concern for that. In its fullest sense, most theologians are going to hold to a kind of immutability, but not one that is an absolute immutability. So the canonicists really begin this. And then when you get theologians like Isaac August Dorner, who ends up being one of the harshest critics of canonicism, he also still affirms a lot of the critics of the canonics in that he writes what is then the most influential book rejecting divine immutability. So in the book is called Divine Immutability or Critical Reconsideration, something like that. It's Fortress Press puts it out in this like giant, really bizarre looking volume that's really uncomfortable to read, but but it's a really influential book, Dorner's work, and he's kind of a mediating theologian, kind of between the conservatives and the Protestant liberals. But he's full of some weird issues. But regardless, the point is the canonicists even have an influence beyond just the Christological issues in getting people to rethink the issues of divine immutability. And that's what David Halas is already anticipating here. He's seeing what are the potential dangers of that, seeing, hey, if we've got divine immutability, you can't have a renunciation of the divine nature itself. Then he says this in point 2 here. He says, the self-renunciation extended even to death on the cross, Philippians 2:8. And the divine nature neither died nor was crucified. And here is where people start to question me. I have a lot of people questioning me on this issue, where I say that in the suffering of Christ, I've had a lot of Lutherans question me about this too. I say, is that really what the Lutheran Orthodox teach? And that's what you see here. This is what the Lutheran Orthodox teach. That in the death of Christ, it is not actually the divine nature that suffers and dies. And I know a lot of people want to make exceptions to say, well, I'm not a canonicist, but the suffering of Christ has to be kind of an exception to that. The divine nature has to suffer in that instance. Not in the view of the Lutheran Orthodox. So when you read someone, and Gerhard's clear about this as well. Now, some people are going to point to, and I've seen people do this, devotional writings where Gerhard talks about God dying on the cross to say, well, he seems to teach that here, that there's a literal divine suffering. But that's really just consistent with the Communicatio in general, that it is a divine person who dies, but according to the human nature. So there is no problem saying God died on the cross, or the Son died on the cross, or the Lord of glory was crucified, as Scripture says. So we don't have to, we don't have to parse out our language in preaching to say something like, well, really it was the divine nature, not the human nature. We don't have to do that. But if we do want to get particular about it in our, careful theological construction of the thing, it is true that the divine nature does not literally die on the cross. The divine nature, because of the Genus Apostalismaticum, we know that all the works that God does, according to that the Son does, according to his person, all of those saving works are done according to both natures. So there is something about the divine nature that shares in that suffering. Yeah, but that is not to say that it shares in the suffering the same way that the humanity does. So that in the suffering, it takes the suffering upon itself in such a way that this is the classical way to understand this, is that the infinitude of the divine nature makes that suffering infinitely valuable. So it has an infinite merit, right? It can cover an infinite amount of sins. And that's something that comes even from Anselm's Credeus Homo, why God became man. So you see that in the death of Christ. So that's a way to say that he's saying that, well, if the humiliation leads to death, even death on a cross, it can't be according to the divine nature, because the divine nature can't die. So Halas is not even arguing for that latter point. He's assuming, well, everyone agrees on that. He's saying, well, we all agree that the divine nature doesn't literally die on the cross. So therefore, if that humiliation is not literally the divine nature dying on the cross, that the divine nature itself cannot be the subject of the humiliation. It has to be the humanity. Then we have another heading, and the headings are by Widener here. He's basically just putting Hollas's citations under a number of headings, and you see that the headings here are pretty clearly outlined in order to confront the kenotic issue. He says, it does not... okay, hold on, I've moved down too far. Humiliation does not consist in entire abandonment of the divine majesty. So here's a quote from Hollas here again. The self-renunciation of Christ consists formally not in the entire abdication or abandonment of the divine majesty. So it's not a complete abandonment, that the majesty is not somehow taken away from Christ altogether. What we talked about last time was there are a couple different ways to frame this among theologians, but we're talking about a shielding of divine majesty. Not that he doesn't have the divine majesty, but he's not displaying or using the divine majesty. That's what Paul means when he's talking in Philippians about, his being God is not something to be fully grasped. It's not something that is fully seen or understood by the people around Christ. Hollas goes on to say, this could not have occurred without a dissolution of the personal union. For, since it is a perfect and inner union, it cannot exist without an impartation of natures and properties. So he's saying that there can't be a real union if there is no majesty there. Like, if you're going to say that there is no divine majesty in the incarnate Christ at all, that's just not exercised with the human nature. But if it's not there at all, well, what you've really done is created kind of a separate person. So he's saying because of the intimacy of the union, if you say there is no majesty, then, well, the divine is the majesty and the person doesn't have the majesty. That means that the human nature doesn't, and the human nature must be a separate person. So you get into all sorts of weird problems in terms of you end up in an Nestorian kind of position. Second point he makes here, he says, during the state of self-renunciation, Christ sometimes produced remarkable proofs of the divine majesty dwelling in the flesh. Although he exercised this majesty very rarely and extraordinarily. So this is just the point that, we can't say that there's an absolute giving up of majesty also just because he does use it. Like, he does use his divine powers throughout his life. So they have to be there somehow. And so the way to explain this that avoids both Nestorianism and, saying that somehow the miracles were not due to the divinity of Christ is to affirm that this majesty belongs to Christ, but it was not exercised actively according to the humanity. Then he goes on to say, and here is where he's going to reject the view of, I think rightly, the view of Brenz. He's going to affirm Chemnitz's perspective here. When he says, it does not consist, or the humiliation here, does not consist in mere concealment or hiding of majesty. So it's not that, and we talked about this as Brenz's view, that there, at the moment of incarnation, there is a kind of ascension of the human nature immediately. There is an ultimate glorification of the human nature immediately. It already has all the properties of divinity, but then it's just hidden. That's all there is to it. He's exercising it, he just is hiding it. And so Hollas, I think rightly, is saying that position fails for pretty significant reasons. And so he's going to say this as reasons. For self-renunciation does not pertain to Christ in his exaltation, although there pertains to him that thing in the state of hiding of majesty. So what we have is clearly in these various texts, and we've looked at these texts a number of times, but in the text where we see this exaltation of Christ's humanity, this being given authority at some point in time, when we look at those realities, it's simply, they do not fit with a perspective that would say, that somehow this is just, that Christ doesn't really gain these properties according to his humanity in any way, that there's no real change of his humanity, that it's a mere, he already had all this stuff, now it's just clearer to us, now we actually see it. The language seems to be far more real, far more of a language of some real change. I don't see it as apparent language. It's not just that, he is, like, we see language that he's exalted to the right hand of God. Like, he's given the name that is above all names. There's all of this stuff that's happening in time. None of those texts give the indication that it is merely, well, he's already had it, now it's just visible or manifest, what wasn't manifest before to human eyes. And I think it does challenge the reality of the humiliation of the human nature. Second, the hiding of gifts is not true self-renunciation. Exactly, this is the problem. It's not a true humiliation. Just as when the sun, covered by clouds, has not been truly darkened, although we do not deny that Christ concealed the possession of communicated majesty and did not everywhere exert it. Yeah, so that's a great analogy. So, right, if the sun is just covered by clouds, the sun has zero change in itself at all. It's not a humiliation of the sun, that sun. But so it's to have it as like a mere cloud or mere hiding means that there's not really a humiliation at all. So we want to acknowledge the reality of the humiliation, unlike, the Bren's perspective. But we don't want to do that in such a way as to say that humiliation is the humiliation then of the divine nature. But we want to say, no, it's the humanity or the human nature of Christ. Okay, then we have, let's see, here's a summary statement from Halas in what is this self-renunciation, the humiliation. He says, self-renunciation consists in the abdication of the full and uninterrupted use of divine majesty. So it's still used, just not uninterruptedly. The assumption of the form of a servant, likeness to other men, and the most humble human obedience. All right, so that's helpful here. Then we have, there are 4 things that are associated with the humiliation that Halas then outlines. Very typical kind of Lutheran scholastic stuff. If you read these authors, you find that they just number everything. So it consists in this many things, and they've got like 4 divisions or 8 divisions, and then they can have subdivisions of everything. They're just very, very particular about dividing things up, which can be dull to some people, but I find it helpful. Sometimes it can be dull, though. I think especially when you're reading Quenstedt can be pretty dull sometimes. I think like sometimes these guys get a little too particular in ways that they don't need to. I don't find that as much in Halas, and I think it's because his work is a little shorter, so he summarizes a little better. But I think Quenstedt's kind of the ultimate systematizer. But unfortunately, Quenstedt's not much of Quenstedt has been translated into English, so if you don't read Latin, it's kind of hard to find some Quenstedt, but there's a little bit out there. All right, so here are the 4 things that are connected with or aspects of the self-renunciation of Christ. So first is the kenosis, which is what we're talking about here, the emptying, which Halas refers to here as a withholding or restraining of the full activity of the constant universal divine majesty and excellence really imparted to Christ as a man. Okay, so that's largely what we've been talking about here. The second point is the taking the form of a servant. So he's not taking the form of king when he comes to this earth, even though he is a king. And yeah, okay, you've got times, the Epiphany and whatnot, that there is a recognition of Christ's kingship, but generally he's taking the form of a servant. He submits to human authorities, and he does that for our sakes. Third is his likeness to man. So that's not just in his likeness to man and in that he shares our nature, but he also does things that ordinary men do. Things that aren't going to be true of Christ in a state of exaltation. So we just have mention of his birth, circumcision, trade as a carpenter, his mode of life, just what he does generally. So he communicates to people like other people would communicate. He learns. He seemingly probably gets sick. He seems to take upon himself and I've made this argument before, and some of this comes from T.F. Torrance, and I think he's right. I think there are bad ways to express this, but I think there are right ways to express this. That there is a sense, hear me clearly here, there is a sense in which the nature that Christ took upon himself in his state of humiliation was a fallen humanity, a fallen human nature. What I don't mean by that is Christ had original sin or he personally sinned or anything like that. So I'm not talking about in the sense of sin. But what Gerhard says is he has the infirmities common to man. In other words, he doesn't have the pre-Adamic human nature. He's not, it's like Adam seemingly, Adam couldn't have died, right? Jesus died. So he clearly experienced human experience in a fallen world in a way that wasn't true of Adam in paradise. And I would say that's part of Christ's passive obedience, that there is a facing of human suffering according to a fallen creation, which he concretely participates in. He's suffering that throughout his life. The culmination, that's what we have in Philippians, right? It's the culmination is his death. but that's not the beginning of it, because it's his whole life. So in a sense, he is having this experience of fallen humanity throughout the entirety of his life. Seemingly, Jesus gets sick. I mean, okay, we're not told that literally in the text. Jesus got sick, by the way, but my assumption would be, from everything else we're told, that that's correct, because he has those common infirmities that other people have. The kind of body that can die is the kind of body that gets sick, right? So, seemingly Jesus can get injuries. His body can weep, things that didn't happen in the pre-fall state. So the humiliation begins pretty much right away, and is apparent throughout the many stages of Christ's life, culminating in his death, but not exclusive to his death. Then the fourth thing is humbling himself and becoming obedient. And Hallaz refers to this as the active and passive obedience of Christ. So active obedience of Christ being that Christ actively obeys the demands of the divine law and fulfills the law for us, fulfilling all righteousness. And the passive obedience is his suffering on our behalf. So he's taking upon himself the punishment of our sins. And as I said, the passive and active obedience are not, sometimes you have this kind of neatly arranged so that it's, the active obedience of Christ is his life, and then kind of at the moment that he's betrayed by Judas, then it becomes passive obedience. And it's not that neat. You can't really cut it apart in such a way as to say, like, this is just active, this part's passive. The entirety of Christ's obedience consists in both active and passive obedience. So, for example, even while he's dying on the cross, he is actively obeying God's law. So, and also, while he is actively obeying the law and his active obedience throughout his life, he is also taking upon himself the sufferings of sin that he doesn't deserve because he's perfect. But he's taking upon himself the sufferings of a sinful world on our behalf. So the passive and active obedience of Christ are intertwined throughout the narrative. I have an essay on this, by the way, in our volume on justification that we put out with our publishing house, with the Widener Institute. You can go to jspublishing.org if you don't have a copy of that. It's the Doctrine of Justification, Essays from the Widener Institute. It is the first of a series of essay volumes, and I know it's been longer than I have wanted it to be for the next volume to come out, but we actually have 3 in the works. So they are coming. The sanctification one I'm still waiting on one essay, but everything else is done and ready to go in that sanctification volume, because I really want to get that out. There's some good authors in there. Sanchez and Bierman have essays in there. It'll get there eventually, so hopefully soon. But in the justification volume, I have an essay on the question of Christ's active obedience. So if you want to see an exegetical treatment of that question of active obedience, my basic argument, because there's a lot of rejection of the active obedience of Christ today. There are a lot of scholars from various places that argue that it's kind of a post-Reformation idea that shows up because of some medieval notions of merit that the Reformation's responding to, that really is very different from a Hebraic worldview. And there's question about Romans 5, which tends to be kind of the classic text that people draw active obedience from, the Adam-Christ parallel. My argument is that the active obedience of Christ does not rest on an exegetical treatment of Romans 5. Because I don't think Romans 5 is actually a very strong treatment. I don't think it's a very strong argument, at least by itself. So my argument is there is a kind of whole broader kind of biblical theological narrative that you have to place Christ in to understand active obedience. It's not one of these things where you have, one proof text of here's your verse on active obedience. It's the whole way something, especially like the Gospel of Matthew is structured, it is structured as Christ as the obedient Israel, right? There are demands upon Adam to obey, he fails. There are demands upon the nation of Israel to obey. There are promises that Israel is going to inherit the promised land and retain the promised land if only they're going to obey God's covenant stipulations. They obviously don't do it, and that's kind of the point, is that they don't do it. And then Christ is portrayed, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, but there are plenty of other places, as the true obedient Israel, as the true obedient son. And in Jesus' life, he obeys where Israel failed, and in doing that, he fulfills the demands of God's law. And so we see this through more the narrative and how the narrative is structured than we do a proof text. That's my argument. But I know that's a little bit of an aside here on that question. So maybe for another time we could delve into that in more depth. But you can pick up that justification volume if you want to read more about that. All right, we've got another treatment of Philippians 2. And I'm trying to look here at how much I really want to get into this because I've already discussed a lot of this, but maybe I'll go a little quickly. Philippians 2, 5 through 8, the Carmen Christi that we've already been discussing, because that's the kind of classic text for the humiliation, it's the primary proof text of the kenoticus. Widener's going to say, all right, how do the Lutheran Orthodox deal with this particular text? So I'm going to go through it quickly. But okay, first we have the phrase being in the form of God. What does that mean? Well, he's got a citation from Quenstedt, which says this. This formally and accurately denotes not the divine essence itself, but properly the glorious divine condition or the glory and universal use of majesty, which cannot exist except with the true Godhead, but presupposes the same in person. Okay, so the form of God is the manner of exaltation of the humanity in union with the divine nature. It's not that he's giving up the form of God in the sense that he's actually giving up his divinity. He's giving up that kind of state of exaltation of the humanity because of its union with the divinity. Second, being in the form of God, and this is all from Quenstedt, by the way. Being in the form of God. So being, what does that mean? He says the participle being or existing is here very emphatic, showing, one, that Christ did not take upon himself the form of God, as it is said that he took himself the form of a servant. So this is talking about the form in which the humanity lived itself out. Is it in the form of God or form of a servant? And that's the contrast that Paul's making here. Two, that with the form of God, Christ is said to have truly possessed at the same time a divine essence and nature. So it's a testament to the divinity of Christ. He does have the form of God, but he doesn't understand it as a thing that is to be grasped, to be understood by us. And then Quenstedt says that Christ Jesus, when he had taken upon himself the form of a servant, neither laid aside the divine nature itself, again, against what later would be the canonic view, nor in any way resigned to the form of God. Okay, again, against the canonic view. But he did not entirely and fully exercise it, did not make an ostentatious display of it, but rather that in the form of a servant he ministered to other men, yet in such a way as always to remain being in the form of God. So we're talking about the exercise of the divine attributes through humanity. This is basically the same position you find in Chemnitz, and then the position you find in Hollatz. This is the same position that Widener is taking. Counted it not a prize. So we're looking at Quenstedt's summary of that phrase. He did not judge that a public display of the majesty of the almighty and omnipresent God would have the form of robbery, but he held the same secretly, and only when it seemed good to him sent forth to be some raised in the form as God. Oh, actually, no, now he's back to Hollatz. I thought this was all Quenstedt here. Sorry. So now he's back to Hollatz. For to be in equality with God, Hollatz says, is to act as though equal in glory and majesty to God. But he emptied himself. Okay, let's see. What does that mean according to Hollatz? I'm going through this quickly just because I've already discussed, I feel like, a lot of this. And I don't want to repeat all of this. By not shedding forth his imparted majesty, but restraining and withholding its full and universal use. There's Hollatz. And then finally, the form of a servant. This is not human nature by itself, but the state of a servant and the humble condition. All right, so there we go. So we've got the general statement of what the renunciation is. We have a summary from Hollatz. Generally speaking, Christ, in the state of self-renunciation, abstained from the full, universal, incessant use of glory imparted through the personal union to his assumed flesh. Okay, we've already kind of read, I think, is it the same statement? Almost the same statement we've already read. Okay, so then we have two, specifically, so we have then the general statement and then the specification of exactly what this means. He suspended and withheld the use of these things. So what are the divine attributes that he is not using in this form of a servant? So first there is omnipotence. And then he gives an illustration of this, why this is clearly the case, is, hey, if he displayed his omnipotence, he couldn't have died. So, all right, if he was he is all-powerful, but if he exercised his omnipotence, his human nature couldn't have died. Okay, second, omniscience. And then he gives an example of this is, he doesn't know the day or the hour of the final judgment. That's part of the state of humiliation. We don't make that assumption that that's true of a state of exaltation. Clearly, there's a shift from not knowing something to knowing something. So the not knowing is him not exercising the divine attribute of omniscience. The next is the most abundant wealth, inasmuch as he became poor for us. So Scripture uses that language of his becoming poor for us. There's citation of 2 Corinthians 8:9. He became poor that we might become rich. There's this kind of great exchange formula that's used there that's often cited by the church fathers in the context of a theosis. So the riches of the divinity are granted to us by his taking upon the poverty of a human nature under the consequences of sin and death. So we're talking here wealth, not just in the sense of like financial things, but he has all things. He's Jesus. So, but we're talking spiritual things largely as well. So he became poor in order to make us rich. Then fourth, omnipresent dominion. So he's not. So even though Christ, according to the divinity, he is omnipresent, but he's not exercising that dominion everywhere according to his humanity there. Then we have, so this is interesting, this final point, and there may be some debate, I think, about this point, but he says, of religious worship of him, inasmuch as he became less than the angels. So he cites Hebrews there that speaks, which is from Psalms, but which speaks about man becoming less than is less than the angels. And so Jesus, this is Psalm 8, but Jesus himself humbled himself into the human position. So, and this is a bit of I think a more complicated one, because it's not like Jesus doesn't accept worship at all in his state of humiliation, but he also doesn't demand worship in the same sense that he is worshipped day in and day out now, right, with all before the throne. So, and I'm thinking Thomas, but of course that's the exalted Christ too, because that's the resurrection where he says, "My Lord and my God." So, but I think you could even say at the Epiphany, the Magi, this is an act of worship coming to Jesus. But he's certainly not displaying the fullness of his majesty, demanding worship in his lifetime. And he's living as a regular human being who is even lower than the angels. Okay, so this humiliation consists in two general acts. These are both from Quenstedt. The first is the abdication of the full and universal use of the imparted majesty. So he has the majesty. It's the abdication of the use of it, not of its existence, or just availing. Two, the assumption of the form of a servant. This form or condition of a servant includes under it certain acts or grades in which it was most clearly manifest. So let's talk then about what the grades of humiliation are. And these largely come here from Gerhard. So we're going back to Gerhard here. He's got Bayer here as well, who we haven't talked about before. He was one that C.F.W. Walther really liked. Another very significant thinker in that time period. So these are the grades of humiliation. What we mean here is here's just an outline of some of the steps, the places in Christ's life where he is demonstrating that self-renunciation. So we're just taking that Philippians text and saying, okay, he became obedient, lived the life of a servant, even unto death on the cross. But what does that life of a servant consist of? What are some of the things that he did to demonstrate that servanthood? So the first is his conception. And that's kind of obvious, but you may ask, well, is being born, is that a humiliation, or is that just human nature itself? And Gerhard makes this point. He says being born in the womb is part of a state of self-renunciation, and he distinguishes that from, say, Adam. And so his point is, even in the choice of being born in a physical human womb, that is an act of self-renunciation or humiliation, because he could have, like Adam, just been created from the dust. And he's called the new Adam, right? But he chooses to go through the regular process of birth. And no offense to my Roman Catholic friends here in their brothers and sisters and the way that they view the Immaculate Conception, but I do think that some of this is the being born of an ordinary womb. I would say that, Mary probably has birth pains like any ordinary human does. That there is a naturalness to the birth process in some way. I know that's a controverted point, and I wouldn't press it too much. But I do think it's interesting. The woman in Revelation does have birth pains as she's giving birth to the Messiah, which I think is kind of a mixed figure of Israel and Mary. And the Roman Catholics use it as an argument for the bodily assumption of Mary. But yeah, that maybe is a whole side tangent, so I'll stop there. So, okay. So then we have his birth, right? So regardless of the birth pains question of Mary, you can kind of, regardless of what you want to do with that. Because, you have that text in Revelation, but of course it's Revelation, so it's not like that clear and it has multiple meanings there, so I wouldn't take it kind of too literally. But regardless of what you do with the birth pains of Mary, the birth or the state of birth is a seemingly ordinary one. And so what's mentioned here is the lowliness of the circumstances. And we think of this as, Jesus being born, in a manger and a trough. And yeah, I know that like most of what we do in terms of our major scenes in movies are not historically accurate at all, but that's regardless. The point is he's not, born in a palace. He didn't choose to be, born of a king and queen. He didn't choose that he would come into a family where he had all the just greatest luxuries in the world. He came in an ordinary, normal, humble human family to an ordinary human mother. The next is his circumcision. And the circumcision of Christ is that by which he made himself subject to the law. So the circumcision is your entrance into the old covenant. It's your entrance into the people of Israel. And as soon as you are circumcised, you become, in a way, a part of the people of Israel. And that also means that you are now subject to all of the obligations that Israelites had. So in being circumcised, Jesus is now obligating himself to obey the demands of the divine law. So now he's obligated to obey. So we could see in some ways the circumcision kind of as the key point at the beginning of that act of obedience. That now he said, I am circumcised, I am an Israelite. Not only an Israelite, but he is Israel. He's Israel embodied, but he's faithful Israel embodied. So he's subjecting himself to the demands of the divine law in his circumcision, and that is what he's going to spend his life doing in his obedience, is now actually obeying the Jewish law. So he, of course, is Lord over the law. He gave the Jewish law. He gave the ceremonial law to sinners. So it is an act of humiliation that he brought himself to be in subjection to his own law. Not just in the sense that a law is a reflection of the divine nature. Okay, then we have his holy rearing and education. So, he voluntarily subjects himself to the commands of his father and mother. His father being his, obviously not biological father, but earthly adoptive father. But this is part of his obeying the law. He honors his father and mother. Does he have to honor his father and mother? Well, certainly not as the eternal Logos. He's the one who created them. He's their Lord. But he humbles himself, submits himself to human parents, and obeys then the commands of his human parents. We're told that there was growth in knowledge and wisdom in Luke 2:40. So this is in relation to his human mind. So he had an ordinary kind of human intellectual development. That's purely his humanity, which is a note that's made here, not his divinity. So the divine nature doesn't learn it. That's in opposition to the nature of what the divine nature, and I hate saying that, but because that sounds weird, but the nature of the divine nature is. So he does grow according to his human understanding. So he has lack of understanding according to his humanity or his human nature. So he grows. We're also told that, and this is the fifth point here, in the way that he deals with men, with others, men and women, but he's just talking about how he interacts in the world. He's treated badly by people. He's rejected at numerous points. He's rejected even in his hometown by the people he grew up with. He's treated badly by one of his closest disciples, his brothers don't believe his message. He subjects himself to just regular infirmities of the difficulties of human relationships, which can be pretty difficult. And so there's a way in which he shows forth his humiliation. And then, of course, the final one here is his great passion. We're told this is number 6. So this is obviously talking about his death. All right. So let's see. Then we have a citation of Beyer here on Matthew 27. We're talking about the forsakenness of Christ on the cross when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This text in modern Christology does wild things. Jürgen Moltmann basically formulates an entire Trinitarian theology out of that phrase, that the forsakenness of the Son creates the Trinity, basically. And he could talk about some of that in more depth. It gets really bizarre. But so how do we interpret this? You also see some other, I've seen this among Reformed preachers sometimes, and I think it's certainly a misunderstanding of their own tradition, but where, you talk about there is a kind of literal abandonment. Like Tim Keller had a tweet that said this, and I know he didn't really mean what he said there, and it was a way to be like, pithy, and it's the nature of Twitter, but sometimes you can kind of fall into heretical things even if you don't mean to because of the brevity of the format. But because I did a video, I think when Keller did that tweet, something about this at the time. But you get phraseology that makes it sound like there's almost this rupture in the Trinity there, that this expresses a real rupture between Father and Son and the ontological Trinity, which is just would kind of destroy the entirety of all existence. God being its ontological foundation. If there's a rupture in God, there's a rupture in all things that exist, and therefore nothing exists. It gets weird, and I don't think that's what's going on. Okay, so you have to be really careful with that phrase in not building an entire theology based on one thing that Jesus says on the cross, which obviously is in the context of an entire psalm. So you have to go back and read the Psalm 22 that he's citing, because then you start to see that this entire psalm is actually a prophecy about having hands and feet pierced and being mocked and all of the other elements of what happens on the cross. So here's Beyer's citation, or his comment on that citation from Matthew's Gospel. He says, "Manifestly, Christ was forsaken, not indeed as though either the bond of personal union were broken." So it's not a personal union. It's not a bond that's broken between the natures, so that it's a separate nature that's forsaken on the cross, calling out about his God-forsakenness, or that he had been altogether rejected from the face of God, because, again, that makes those Trinitarian problems pretty bad, never to be taken back again into grace, nor that he actually and properly speaking despaired, but that in that greatest accumulation of evils, because of the sins of men imputed to him, he, while bearing the part of all sinners, so felt the wrath of God, or that God was estranged from him, that he felt no comfort within himself from the fullness of the indwelling Godhead. So here's the ultimate cry of the effect, the mental toll of the taking upon the wrath of God, the punishment for sin upon himself in this profound expression, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that is real without dissolving the two natures or the unity of Father and the Son. And of course there's mystery here. Like this, of all places where we're going to find mystery, of course it's going to be on the cross and how the divine and human natures relate on the cross. I mean, we're not going to be able to answer every question here or totally understand what this means. All right, so then we have his passion and his suffering here as 6. But then we do also have a couple other things, going beyond just the passion in terms of his suffering, and that is when there is this dissolution of body and soul in Christ. So after the passion comes the death of Christ, and at the death of Christ, the natural union of body and soul is dissolved. So it's important to clarify here, because the question may be, well, does the divinity now depart from the humanity? The question may be, well, there's a body in the grave, a dead body that's buried, and then you have a divine nature elsewhere, because you do have Jesus doing things. I mean, you've got the whole account of him going to minister or proclaiming to the spirits in prison, which is a confusing topic for another time, but seemingly he's doing that according to his divine nature. So what happens? Is there a rupture at the point of death? And the way that Lutheran theologians are going to argue this is it's not a rupture between divinity and humanity at the death of Christ. It's a rupture between body and soul that happens when everybody dies, which is also part of the fall, because without the fall, there wouldn't be this death and separation of body and soul, and there would just be, and eventually will be at the resurrection, a reunion of body and soul. But he retains that union of the divinity with the humanity even then. So even the human body, as it's in the tomb, is still united hypostatically to the divinity. The soul of Jesus is united to the divinity. So the body and soul of Jesus, though, in that human experience of death that he faces, are separated from one another. Neither is separated from the divine nature itself. So there is no kind of rupture between the natures, or two natures to one nature to two natures again at the resurrection, or something like that. And I think the only way you would do that is if you say that humanity is just a body and just physical, which leads to one among many problems of physicalism and its damaging effects on Christian theology. Okay, let's see. So I'm gonna, and there's also mention here of this, because I know I've got only a few minutes left and I want to finish this section. There's mention here of the fact that, in numerous points, John 10 is cited here where Jesus is talking about laying his life down for the sheep, that this is a self-giving of Christ. Christ is, when he dies, this is not we have misunderstandings of this all the time, that there is some kind of separated, wrathful father that forces his son to die on the cross to punish him or something. Not the case biblically at all. The son freely chooses to give himself up for sinners, and freely chooses to die on the cross. This is not, the only way that you get that other view is from a view of eternal functional subordination, where the son has to submit to the father, instead of a classical Trinitarian understanding, which says there is one divine will, which is the divine essence, and therefore the will of the son to die is the son's will and the father's will and the spirit's will, because it's one will, because there's one nature, and nature is will, and will is nature. And that gets back to divine simplicity. Okay, so let me read. This is a quote from Quenchtet here. He says this: "In the dissolution of the soul from the body, the dissolution of the union of the two natures in Christ is not to be inferred." Okay, clear. "For although the natural union between soul and body was broken, yet the personal union existing between the Logos and the assumed human nature was not separated. But the divine nature in Christ remained truly united to the soul, which was separated from the body and truly united to the body in the sepulchre. The entire divine nature was in the separated soul, and the entire divine nature was in the body left upon earth, without any division or distension, as either of these would be in conflict with the divine nature." Then we move on after this. I'm not reading all of this. I'm kind of skimming through this to hit the high points. But then we get to the burial of Jesus. And the burial of Jesus being the clear demonstration that his body actually died. We don't have his we don't have his dying on the cross and then immediately when he dies his body just disappears or something, or his body kind of raises off the cross and ascends to heaven immediately. He even takes upon himself the reality of a human burial, the reality of a dead body in a tomb. Now, the interesting thing is here about this state of, what we talk about in like Holy Saturday, which is the full day between the death and resurrection of Jesus. Right? He dies on Good Friday. Holy Saturday, he's in the tomb all day. Sunday, he raises from the grave. We talk about the 3 days. It doesn't mean 3 full 24-hour days, but he's dead on a period of 3 different days. Okay, but on that event of Holy Saturday, where he's lying in the tomb, there is an intertwining of the humiliation and exaltation of Christ at the same time. So there is a bit of a kind of overlap. So in one sense, the fullness of the humiliation is done when he says it is finished, because the exaltation begins then. But when you have Holy Saturday, you have kind of two realities going on at the same time, the reality of body and soul, and both are fully united to the Logos. So the body is partaking of humiliation in a sense, in that it's a dead body, okay? A dead body only dies because of sin. Even though Jesus didn't sin, that body is, dead. Then you get, along with that, the fact of Christ going and proclaiming to the spirits in prison, which we would have to do a whole separate program on if we want to delve into that, because there's a debate about what that text means. But in a Lutheran understanding, because this does show up in the Book of Concord, though not all questions are answered there, but it does show up in the formula, that in a Lutheran understanding, this is part of the exaltation of Christ. This is a proclamation of victory over the spirits in prison. This is not a Jesus goes to hell to suffer more. Like, the suffering is done. So that Holy Saturday has these kind of overlapping realities of humiliation and exaltation at once. Ultimately, then, the resurrection of Jesus is that reunion of body and soul. And at that time, there is no more humiliation at all. So it's after that we then get into the questions of the exaltation of Christ. So then that's going to be our next program. We're going to look at the exaltation of Christ. And then we will also look at some criticisms of the Lutheran treatment of the humiliation and exaltation of Christ. Once we are done with that, we get into the final section of this series. And in the final section of this series, we're going to be looking at Christological developments in liberal theology. And as I've said, when I'm done going through this text, I want to spend a little bit of time at least going through some more modern Christological debates and developments that have happened within the last 100 years. Well, I thank you so much for watching and or listening to this. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your podcast app, and we will see you in the next one. God bless.